Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2021. This is Rudranarayan Das, Executive Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development. We are proud to announce that this conference is conducted along with Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, Central University of Odisha, Koraput, and Ravenshaw University, Cuttack. In today's symposia, I welcome our speaker, Professor David Livingstone Smith, and participants across the globe through Facebook and YouTube Live. The broader theme of this conference is agnotological context, disciplinary practices of social sciences, and policy frames. On behalf of Center for Adivasi Research and Development, I extend my profound gratitude to Professor Dr. Sanjay Kumar Naik, respected Vice Chancellor, Central Ravenshaw University, Professor Dr. Sharat Kumar Palita, respected Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha, and Dr. Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management. The convener of this largest virtual conference are eminent Indian historian, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent policy activist, writer, and philanthropist, Mr. Charudat Panigrahi. The main outcome of this conference is to come up with the national and international framework for the education system in future. The crux of this conference will be the use of digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, augmented realities, and virtual realities that is being increasingly adopted after the outbreak of COVID pandemic. We hope this conference would help students, faculties, researchers, and all to expand their mental horizon and help the education system to adopt the best in this pandemic era. Ladies and gentlemen, the Center for Adivasi Research and Development is a leading research-oriented institution promoting ethnographic, empirical, and evidence-based research for engaging and addressing the challenges that 21st century globe is facing today. The prime agenda of this institution is to come up with the potential policy solution for social change while believing in the idea of debate, dialogue, and discussion, and expertise, experiencing, and education. The institution focuses on marginalized communities and works for their livelihood to protect the nature, culture, language, and identity in particular. The age of modernity has witnessed that change is the only constant phenomena for the societal purpose to enhance knowledge. Our information work for them is methodical and avoid paradoxically frameworks which neglected so many centuries from theory to become practice. The Center for Adivasi Research and Development sincerely believes in the concept of social marketing, which is seriously looking for non-profit marketing and builds new social entrepreneurship for check and balance mechanism to glorify generations to come. Center for Adivasi Research and Development is come up to solve with the holistic approach of critical thinking in education to fill the gaps, to plan accordingly for the voiceless communities, for beneficiaries direct in self-reflecting global South societies. Ladies and gentlemen, in this evening, in India, we have with us one of the finest philosopher, Professor David Livingstone Smith. Professor Smith is a professor of philosophy at the University of New England. He has published 10 books. His 2011 Less Than Human and Why We Demon, Enslave and Exterminate Others won the 2012 Annie Fields Wolf Award for non-fiction. David's most recent book, Making Monsters, the Uncanny Powers of Dehumanization, will be published by Harvard University Press later this year. David has recently described in the Times Literary Supplement as a philosopher seeking not just to interpret the world, but to change it. His book on inhumanity is praised by Harvard University philosopher Cornel West as a philosophically sophisticated and prophetically courageous treatment of dehumanization, especially in regard to race, and by LA University historian Timothy Cinder as film but gentle, wise but accessible. David is an interdisciplinary scholar whose publications are cited not only by other philosophers but also by historians, legal scholars, psychologists, and anthropologists. He has been featured in primetime television documentaries, is often interviewed and cited in the national and international media, and was a guest as the 2012 G20 Economic Summit, where he spoke about dehumanization and mass violence. Finally, he is the full-time advisor of the Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha. Professor David will be talk about how dehumanization make monsters in today's session. Now, without taking much time, I would like to invite Dr. Smith to initiate his talk. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, sir, please.
Okay, that's great. So I'm afraid the introduction I sent you might have been a slightly out of date one, because Making Monsters, my latest book, came out last month, or actually in October, so the month before last, right at the end, however. And I want to talk to you a little bit in the time that has been so generously granted to me about some of the ideas in that book. And I would, before doing that though, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me, and to say what an honor it is to be associated with CARD. I think it from all that I've read and seen, it's a very worthy and important project. So, as the title of my talk suggests, I'm going to talk about dehumanization, and I'm going to talk about monsters. And I'm going to talk about the way these two ideas come together. That is, I want to share with you my views about how when one group of people dehumanizes another group of people, they very often, not always, but very often, see that other group of people as monstrous, as demonic, as powerful, evil, destructive beings. And this has resulted in untold tragedy in human history, around the world, from ancient times to the present. I actually wish I knew more about the history of India, so I could use examples from your history to illustrate what I have to say. But alas, I don't. It's something I'll need to study at some point in the years that I have left in my life. And perhaps in 5 years, I can come back to you and give you a talk. I know in particular how, I'll start again, in particular how one group of people conceives of those whom they regard as their enemies. And I came across all of this wartime propaganda in which enemies are described as less than human, as vermin to be exterminated, or bloodthirsty predators to be hunted down, or animals to be killed for sport, for fun. There are many, many examples of these things if you look at the propaganda that's produced during wartime. And I thought to myself, this is very interesting. I really would like to find out more about this. And I looked around and I discovered there's a remarkably limited literature, research literature on this phenomenon. Almost all of it was in social psychology. And almost all of it still is in social psychology. So when I began investigating this process of dehumanization, there wasn't really a philosophical literature focused on it that I could draw on, nor was there a literature in political science or anthropology specifically concerned with theorizing dehumanization. So, and very strikingly, there were no books. It was all articles in journals. So a friend persuaded me to embark upon this for my next book. I always like to be writing something, working on a book, and he persuaded me to write a book pulling everything I could find together about dehumanization and theorizing it and tracing out its history and so on. That was my first book on dehumanization that was published in 2011. And it was entitled, as the gentleman who introduced me stated, Less Than Human, Why We Demean, Enslave, and Exterminate Others. Then 10 years passed by, 10 years of further study. When I wrote Less Than Dehumanization, it was a voyage of discovery. I didn't know what I was going to find. I was unfamiliar with the territory. I was just piecing things together. But during the intervening 10 years or more now, I was able to refine my ideas, to respond to criticisms, to criticize some of my own ideas, and develop a different picture, or at least an improved picture. And I'll explain all of this to you in just a moment once I get through with this introduction. Last year, my book on inhumanity, Dehumanization and How to Resist It, was published. And as I said, 2 months ago, Making Monsters, The Uncanny Power of Dehumanization, was published by Harvard University Press. That book in particular represents my current views. It's not that different in essence from On Inhumanity, but it goes more deeply into the subject matter. On Inhumanity was written for a very broad audience, and there's a reason I did that, by the way. In fact, I write all of my books now for a very broad audience. The reason for that is I think this topic is far too important to be limited to academics or to be simply written about in articles that very few people will read. You know, I write about this because I think it is a terribly morally significant topic. And it's a topic that we need all of us to pay attention to. Because dehumanization is associated and facilitated some of the very, very worst things that human beings have done to one another. It oils the machinery of atrocity, oppression, enslavement, genocide. And if we want to prevent these things from happening, then we need to understand a lot about how they work, what their machinery is. And theorizing, explaining, understanding dehumanization gives us part of the answer to that, I believe. Not all of the answer by any means, but part of the answer. Anyone who talks about dehumanization needs to explain right up front what they mean by the term. And the reason for that is simple. The word dehumanization is used in lots and lots and lots of different ways. It's even in the academic literature. It's used as a name for lots of different things. And if we go out of the academic literature and say Google the word dehumanization, what we find is that it's used in even more ways. And these are very, very diverse and sometimes only very loosely related meanings. And that's a problem if we want to theorize dehumanization, right? We need a clear idea of what we're addressing, a clear conception of dehumanization. So let me tell you what I mean by dehumanization, more or less. And in doing that, I'm not saying that other meanings of the word are wrong. It's just that the word dehumanization means lots of different things. What I mean is that, first of all, dehumanization is an attitude. Dehumanization happens in people's minds. It's a psychological phenomenon. And what it is the attitude of conceiving of others, picturing others as less than human creatures, as creatures, and I didn't say animals, notice, I said creatures, which are in some important sense inferior to human beings. Now, let me explain that notion of inferiority. In a moment, I'll explain something about how this notion of inferiority arises. What I mean here is having less intrinsic value. So, look, value can be what we philosophers call intrinsic, or it can be instrumental. The instrumental value of a thing is what it gets us, right? So money has instrumental value, right? It's by itself, it's not valuable. It's only valuable for what it can get us. But you might say knowledge or love have intrinsic value. That is, they're valuable all by themselves, all in themselves. So when I say that when we dehumanize others, we think of them as having less intrinsic value than human beings do, what I mean is dehumanized people don't matter to those who dehumanize them. Their lives don't matter. They can be treated in ways that it would be impermissible to treat those whom we regard as human beings. In addition to having less value, having lower value in the eyes of their dehumanizers, dehumanized people are often seen as well as dangerous, as deadly, as beings that need to be constrained, locked up, or exterminated. Now, there's a tendency for people to think of that dehumanization is just so strange that it must be, it can't be real. It can't be real. There are many people who think that when others, when people talk about others as subhuman creatures, this must not be what they literally mean. It must be just a way of degrading them, disrespecting them, harming them as weapons. It's very strange. There are ways to make sense of it. We have plenty of information both from psychology and from the history of ideas to understand how dehumanization works. And therefore, to turn back to the title of this talk, How Dehumanization Makes Monsters. If you're in doubt about the genuineness of dehumanization, if you doubt that people really can literally think of other people as subhuman, let me just give you one example. And this is testimony. So this sort of information, and I'm reading to you from Making Monsters from the very beginning, is not all that common, but there are some examples of people who have engaged in terrible atrocities and who tell us that when they were engaging in those atrocities, they were in sort of an altered state of consciousness, a strange state of mind in which they didn't. So let me read to you. I'll just read a little more than a page. Quote, "They did not know that the Tutsi were human beings, because if they had thought about that, they wouldn't have killed them. Let me include myself as someone who accepted it. I wouldn't have accepted that they are human beings." End of quote. Eli Nagarambi, a Hutu man, spoke these words to the US political scientist Daniel Jonah Goldhagen in 2008. Nagarambi was talking about his role in the 1994 Rwanda genocide, during which he bludgeoned and hacked Tutsi women, men, and children to death. Goldhagen confessed his perplexity at how anyone could perform the horrendous acts that were everyday occurrences during the genocide. "I find it hard to understand," he said, "and I want to understand how people could approach other people who are begging for their lives and screaming in pain and chop them." In doing so, he expressed the same sort of mute incomprehension that many of us experience when reading about these events, or about the horrors of the Nazi extermination camps, or about any of the all too frequent episodes of collective brutality that deface human history. Struggling to adequately describe the state of mind that allowed him to butcher his neighbors, Nagarambi responded, "That's a hard question to answer. But even though you did it, you knew they had the same flesh as you." He went on and said, "It was very sad when a baby would cry. I did not kill children, but at some point you felt guilty. You would see an infant who's just learning to smile, and it smiles at you, but you still kill it. It was a cloud that came into people's hearts and covered them, and everything became dark. You're holding a machete over someone who's weak and is saying, 'Please, I'll give you money. Please forgive me.' Or a woman would say, 'I'm a beautiful woman. Please take care of me.' But instead you kill them. This genocide, when we look back and think about it, is beyond our ability to understand. I cannot explain it. The only answer I can give is that it was like being in a fog, something like a darkness." So I think it's important to take his word seriously and take seriously the mountains of historical evidence that people have in the past and all too often still do think of other people whom they harm as less than human. So let's begin with maybe what is the main puzzle, the main obstacle to taking dehumanization seriously. And it's just this. Suppose you were dehumanizing me. Now, I'm of Jewish ethnicity. Let's suppose that you're Nazis, that you're anti-Semites. I'm sure you're not, but let's pretend for a moment. And if you are true believing Nazis, you would think of me as what the Nazis called an Untermensch, which means a subhuman. You would look at me and think of me not as a human being like you are, but as something less than human, a subhuman. This is very strange, isn't it? Because here I am, I'm speaking to you in a human language. I'm wearing human clothes. I'm wearing glasses. In every important respect, I look like and behave like anyone who you would really consider to be, without doubt, a human being. So, how is it possible for you to think of me as something else? Well, psychologists have explained this, actually. Psychologists have explained, and this is a very robust research program in psychology that's been going on, well, really for some time, but especially since the late 1980s, which holds that we human beings have a tendency to think that the way a being looks on the outside is not necessarily what it is on the inside. So the idea here is that what makes anyone a human being is something inside of them, something which can't be observed. As the psychologists call this, the essence, the human essence. Now, there really, scientifically, there isn't any such thing. But it's a way that we naturally tend to think. We naturally tend to think. So if you take any kind of living thing, say a dog, the idea is what makes an animal a dog is not how it looks and how it behaves, but what it really is. Now, when we look at a dog, the way that the dog appears suggests to us that it's a dog, but the appearance is really just a symptom. It's an indicator. So let me give you an analogy that I like to use. Suppose you're ill with a cold. You have a sore throat, you're sneezing, you have a runny nose. Well, the cold isn't those things. The cold isn't the symptoms. The symptoms are caused by the cold. And what the cold is a virus infection. You can't see the virus. All you can do is infer its existence from the symptoms. And that's very much how human beings very easily and naturally think about the world of living things. The appearance is the symptoms, and what a thing really is the essence. Now, this comes very, very easily to us. Let me just give you one example. This way of thinking is natural for us. So the example is this. A long time ago, in the year 1215, there was a meeting of the Roman Catholic Church, and it was decided that the communion wafer, the little wafers, the little crackers that are used in the ritual of communion in the Roman Catholic Church, it was decided that each of these little crackers was literally the body of Jesus Christ. Not symbolically, literally. That was his flesh. Now, that's very strange. That's even stranger than dehumanization. Because a little wafer that you eat in a religious ritual, the wafer does not look like Jesus, right? It doesn't look like a Palestinian Jew who lived 2,000 years ago. So what's going on? Well, the idea was, although it appeared like a wafer, its essence, what it really is inside, is Jesus. It's the which then the the devotees are consuming when they eat it. So we're pretending you're Nazis and I'm a Jew, and you think of me as a subhuman. What's really going on psychologically, I think, is that you fully admit that I appear to be a human being, but what I really am on the inside is something else, something less than human. So my appearance is deceptive, you see. I'm a counterfeit human being in your eyes. And as I said, there's a really large body of psychological research that backs this sort of idea up. Now, that should take away some of the strangeness of dehumanization. So it's not impossible, after all, to confront another human being and think of them as less than human. There's a perfectly good psychological explanation of how that can happen. But what about less than human? What about the idea of people being less than human, of being lower, of having less intrinsic value? Well, that is explained by another feature of human psychology, which unfortunately has not really been researched by psychologists, to the best of my knowledge. And believe me, I've been through the literature. And what that is hierarchical thinking. So I said this has not been researched by psychologists. It has been researched by historians of ideas. And although I dispute their interpretation of it, I think that work is very, very important. So the main idea here is that there are higher beings and lower beings. There are beings that are more perfect, have greater value than other beings further down the scale. Almost all the scholarly literature on this idea turns to a book, a single book that was published in 1936, written by the philosopher Arthur Lovejoy. It's called The Great Chain of Being. And what Lovejoy says is, in late antiquity, this, say 2,000 years ago, maybe a little more, Europeans developed this idea built from elements of the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, that the universe is arranged like a hierarchy. There are a series of ranks. So God was seen to be at the top, supremely perfect, and dead matter. Someone needs to be muted. Dead matter is at the bottom, dirt, rocks, stuff like that. And every kind of thing was assigned to a rank, either higher or lower. Human beings assign themselves to a very high rank on this scheme, and all other animals and then plants were lower, lower, lower down. They were less than human. Lovejoy thought that this idea persisted for centuries and then died. It died out in the late 18th century, early 19th century, with the birth of scientific ideas about the biological world. So there are two things about this which I think are wrong, that are just incorrect. One thing is the idea that it is an exclusively human, an exclusively European idea. It's not. We find this idea of a hierarchy of higher and lower beings in many, many places in the world. In the traditional ideas, religious ideas, philosophical ideas, from West Africa, from from the indigenous cultures of Latin America, from the Indian subcontinent, from China, all over the world. And it's not gone. That is, we still tend to think of the world in this way. We still tend to think that some lives matter more than others. And this is true, by the way, even if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, right? The vegetable lives don't matter as much as, say, animal lives to you. So this way of thinking, higher and lower, is still very much with us. And that's what gives us the idea of less than human, of things that are lower than we are, we human beings. So if we combine these two ideas, what we get is the idea is that one group of people, when they dehumanize another group of people, for instance, the way that white Americans have dehumanized Black Americans, how the Buddhist majority in Myanmar dehumanizes the Muslim minority, the way Nazis dehumanize Jews, and there are many, many, many more examples, unfortunately. Just go to any genocide and you'll find them. What's going on is the group of dehumanizers is thinking of those whom they dehumanize as having a human appearance, yes, but the essence of something less than human. In other words, no matter what they look like, what they really are on the inside is less than human. And then that at least permits their bad treatment, the bad treatment of them. One of the things I try to do in my writings is give a lot of examples. And I describe them very graphically. And there are two reasons for that. One reason for giving a lot of examples is to overcome the skepticism that some people have about the idea of dehumanization. Their difficulty believing it's real. And I describe these examples quite graphically because I want to take people and shake them. I want to say, look, this is really, really, really important. This is a terrible, destructive process. Please take it seriously. I want to use one of these examples now to move on to the topic of monsters. And the example I use, maybe I'll use two actually, rather more briefly. There are two examples that I use in the second chapter of my book, Making Monsters. They're examples of spectacle lynchings in the United States. So, I mean, I suppose maybe it's not a good supposition that many, many of you are familiar with the notion of lynching. You know, lynching is extrajudicial execution, basically at bottom. The mob takes someone who they believe has committed some sort of crime and kills them without trial. This happened a lot in the United States, and it happened a lot. In fact, it happened mostly to Black Americans at the hands of white Americans. And it involves a lot more than simply execution. Spectacle lynchings were lynchings that were performed before a large audience, often thousands of people who were spectators. And these spectators watched as the victim, who was not generally tried, not taken to trial, was simply accused. They watched as the victim was tortured, brutalized, and then killed, often by being burned alive. This happened many times in the United States. One such example was the lynching in the year 1893 of a man named Henry Smith. Henry Smith was a mentally disabled farm worker, black farm worker. He was accused of murdering and raping a child. And it was said that he confessed, but the evidence is against the fact that it's against the claim that he confessed. Anyway, he was caught. He was taken to the town where the crime occurred. And after a series of humiliations, he was placed on a platform before a crowd of 10 or 20,000 people who watched as the family of the victim took iron rods that had been heated up in a fire so they were red hot. And they used those iron rods to burn his body. They ran the iron rods over his body, not killing him, just torturing him. And then they burnt out his eyes, stuck the rods down his throat. He was still alive, and they burned him to death afterwards. And after they burned him to death, the crowd pressed in to take bits of his burned body as souvenirs, as trophies, rather like hunting trophies. It was a horrible thing. 6 years later, a man named Sam Hose, in a different part of the American South, was accused of a crime that he was almost certainly innocent of. He was bound to a tree. Skin was stripped off of him. His fingers were cut off. His penis was cut off. And he was burned to death. Again, slowly burned to death. And once again, the crowd came in. They took parts of his body. They took parts of his body even when he was alive. The fingers, the ears that were cut off, his penis that was cut off. I mean, it is utterly, utterly unthinkably barbaric. Now, one of the things that's really informative is that when you look at newspaper reports of these two lynchings, and many others, by the way, what you find is that the victims are often described as monsters, as demons, as fiends, as well as beasts, as animals. Now, that raises an interesting question. And it raises an interesting question about the idea of monsters, right? Because monsters, remember the notion of the great chain of being I described, the hierarchy of nature with God at the top and human beings just below the angels and all other sorts of living things down, 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 which actually I didn't explain and I should, is inconsistent with the scientific picture of the world. The world isn't arranged like that. Darwin taught us that. Well, monsters don't fit in to that scheme at all. Monsters aren't part of the order of nature. In fact, monsters and demons, I sometimes use the same word, monsters, for both, because it's basically the same idea. Monsters are supposed to be unnatural beings. They're not part of the order of nature at all. They're outsiders. So what's going on? What's going on? Well, to make sense of this, I explored a lot of literature in anthropology, in psychology, and in philosophy. And it eventually, I think, came clear to me what's going on. And that's what I want to share with you now. The first point to make, before even getting into how dehumanization makes monsters, is a fact about us. And that fact is that we are highly, highly social animals. There is no mammal that is anywhere near as social as we are. And that has two implications. One implication of that is that we are very, very sensitive to indications of humanness in others. In particular, the sight of a human face triggers this response. It's very difficult to look into a pair of human eyes, looking at a human face, and not respond to that other as a human being. You may not like them. You may hate them. You may despise them. But that's all consistent with recognizing them as a fellow human being. Even the Nazis, there was a policy in Auschwitz, the extermination camp, of not looking into the prisoners' eyes. The guards would not look into their eyes. Why? Well, that would trigger the humanizing response. And the reason that's important is it has to do with another feature of all social animals, and it's especially true of us because we're so highly social. But social animals have to have inhibitions against harming their own kind. That's a necessary condition of social life. You can't maintain a social life if you're ripping each other's throats out, right? So there has to be inhibitions against aggression. Now, aggression happens, right? Inhibitions can be overcome, but the inhibitions must be there in order to maintain a social way of life. Now, you might think, well, come on, David, look at history, look at the bloody record of our species, look at the wars and genocides. Hegel characterized history as a slaughterhouse, and there's a great deal of truth in that. Yeah, there is a great deal of truth in it. It's just that what I just said to you isn't the whole story. It's part of the whole story. Because what we human beings, being so clever, have done is we've found ways to disable, to override our own inhibitions against committing terrible acts of violence. And there are many ways that we have done this. One way is the use of mind-altering rituals. It's very common before battle, even today, actually, but in indigenous cultures all over the world, to engage in these ritual practices that disinhibit aggression. The use of drugs, narcotics, or alcohol to free up aggression. That's another one. The use of certain religious ideologies, involving that you're killing at the behest of God, overcomes inhibitions. Dehumanizing propaganda is another way. Getting people to think of others not only as less than human, but as dangerously less than human, does two things. It makes killing and other atrocities permissible. You can treat others like cockroaches or mosquitoes. And it also motivates it. These others are dangerous. We need to protect ourselves from them. They're carriers of disease, or they're violent beasts. Okay, so that's the setup. So that one of the things that tells us there, let me make it explicit. Dehumanization has a function. There's something that it's for. And what it's for is to get people to do terrible things to other people, to overcome that very natural reluctance to spill blood, to spill human blood. Now, when I say it's to get people to do this, that has an important implication. In my opinion, dehumanizing beliefs don't spontaneously occur in the human mind. We don't wake up one day and just find ourselves thinking, these other people, say the indigenous, the tribal peoples of India, are less than human. That doesn't happen. What happens is that people in positions of power and authority convince us through clever propaganda or through their sheer force of authority that some group of people, some others, are less than human, are beasts in human appearance. That was a phrase, by the way, that beasts in human appearance, a 17th century writer, English writer, said that the English slaveholders in the Caribbean thought of Africans, enslaved Africans, as beasts in human appearance. Okay, so now think about it. We got two things going here. We've got the idea that human beings just can't help seeing others as human. That's part of our evolutionary heritage. It's just an automatic response to one another. Looking at me here, even though it's an image on a screen, I would wager, I would bet that you cannot help, even if you tried very hard, to respond to me as a human being. That's beyond your control. But at the same time, there are people in positions of authority who tell us, who convince us, who frighten us into thinking of others as less than human. And we, for reasons that I can certainly explain, although I don't want to exceed the time allotted to me, we have an inclination under the right circumstances to accept those views. Right? Many, 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 many examples. Because you see, it's a feature of human culture that we philosophers like to call sometimes the division of cognitive labor, that there are those who are supposed to know, who have specialized knowledge that we ordinary people don't have. And if we grant them that authority, even if they don't deserve it, then we're likely to accept what they say, even if it contradicts what our eyes tell us and our ears tell us and our senses tell us. So in this situation, then, where there are propagandists saying these Jews, these natives, these Africans, they're not really human. On one hand, we have that, and on the other hand, we have our unstoppable automatic responsiveness, our natural tendency to recognize other members of our species as human. In that kind of circumstance, what goes on is that we have two contradictory images, two contradictory representations of others, of dehumanized others, as dangerous subhumans and as humans. And it's that combination, that contradiction, that transforms these others into monsters. You see, monsters I'm talking about, I'm actually here drawing on the work of a philosopher who did a fascinating study of horror fiction. And one of the things he did was he tried to understand the notion of the monster, the horrific monster, as he called it, drawing on horror fiction and drawing on anthropology. And the conclusion he came to, I think, is very, very interesting and important. To be a monster, a being has to have two characteristics. They have to be seen as physically dangerous, as threatening. They're out to harm you, to kill you. Dehumanized groups are very typically, at least in the worst form of dehumanization, which I call demonizing dehumanization, they're seen as dangerous, as criminal, as terrorists, as rapists. This is just very, very standard. The theme repeats over and over and over again from culture to culture to culture. So that's physical threat. But physical threat isn't enough to make a monster, to demonize someone. They have to be what I like to call metaphysically threatening. That is, they have to be impossible combinations of contradictory characteristics. What do I mean? Well, let's go to the example that I just gave. A being is metaphysically threatening when it defies what we think of, or when we believe that it defies the order of nature. In cases of dehumanization, if I'm right, this is precisely what happens. When dehumanizers think of others as both human and subhuman at the same time, this makes them metaphysically threatening. It turns them into monsters in the eyes of those who dehumanize. And one of the terrible tragedies of this is that very typically, the group of people who is dehumanized is the most vulnerable, the most marginalized members of a society. But when they're turned into monsters, when they're represented as monsters, they're no longer seen as victims. They're seen as powerful aggressors who can be treated in the most appalling, violent, brutal fashion. I'll finish there. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to respond to any questions or criticisms that you might have of my position.
Thank you, sir, for drawing a very clear-cut idea on dehumanization. And actually, it was an eye-opening discussion. And the way that you analyze the psychology that tend to think others as less than human. If we look at the Indian context, you see the history of 3,000 years of the casteist history of Hindu social order. If we say the way Brahmins has treated these Shudras as untouchables, even they were denied all types of social privileges. They are not allowed to sit together with the Brahmin upper caste Brahmins. They are not allowed to. The Brahmins are not allowed to take food there. Not the food distribution. There are also the restriction on marriage, on intercaste marriage. There was also huge atrocities on the Dalits. Especially the B.R. Ambedkar also raised a serious concern at the time. Gandhi also entitled them as Harijan. Well, and the very well that then Nelson Mandela that raised the voice about the apartheid in South Africa is really against the dehumanization. So my idea is, do you think that the dehumanization is a mindset or something else? Then how we can curb that type of mindset? If we look at the anti-Semitism, if you see that what happened in Germany between the 1941 to 45, the Nazi German killed 6 million Jews. The way the atrocities we have witnessed against the Jews, then how you look at that?
Well, it is a mindset, but it's not just a mindset. So you can't think of dehumanization as something that's exists in isolation from the political and cultural circumstances that people are embedded in, right? So this is why I emphasize propaganda. I didn't mention the term ideology, but ideology is very important too. What dehumanization is sort of at the interface of these two things. It's to understand dehumanization, you have to understand psychological processes, but you also have to understand historical, social, and political processes and the way that they impact on our psychological dispositions. I think that's one reason why dehumanization hasn't really been studied properly, because you have to come at it from actually more than two angles, three angles. There's the psychology, there are the political forces, and then there are the cultural factors, which determine the shape that dehumanization takes. So the caste system, as it's practiced and has been practiced in India for thousands of years, is uniquely Indian. There's a cultural component which determines that form. There are similarities, but also profound differences between the position of Jews, say, in the Middle Ages in the German-speaking lands in Europe, or the position of enslaved Africans in the Americas during the 18th and 19th centuries, right? There are very important similarities, but there are very important cultural differences. I think the psychological dimension is precisely the same. There are political differences, because you see, looking at the politics helps us to understand why a certain group of people is dehumanized at a particular point in history in a particular place.
Yes.
So the dehumanization, the increasing dehumanization of Muslims in India, for instance, there are very specific political circumstances that's related to, right? So it's actually very complex phenomenon.
Thank you, sir. There are some questions in the chat box. I'm going to read it for you.
Okay.
Dr. Jayasri Raut asked a question. Terrorist groups like Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, Boko Haram, Laskar, etc., Hizbul Mujahideen, and many more across the globe, etc., are the best examples of committing the dehumanization. Currently, what Taliban is doing in Afghanistan is the greatest example of dehumanization. My humble question is, can these monsters be called humans for their brutal and inhuman acts? Now, how can humans behave more violently than wild animals? Are they lacking in human attributes within, within though having human forms without? How can these inhumans be converted to humans?
Okay, well, first of all, they are humans. When we think of them as monsters or as non-humans, we're dehumanizing them, right? We're committing the very act that we should all be trying to put a stop to. What these people do is they show us what we're capable of, what human beings are capable of. And that's really important. So we should look at our image in the mirror that they hold up to us. And if you think, no, there's no circumstance where you would be capable of doing that, I would encourage anyone to think again, right? Imagine you, as a child, grew up in a Taliban family, right? Do you think you would somehow be immune to those influences? Of course you wouldn't. Or if you were an ordinary white Southerner in the year 1893, you might have been in the crowd watching Henry Smith being tortured and executed. And because of the influences brought to bear on you, and because of our vulnerability to slipping into dehumanizing ways of thought, that would have all seemed okay. Let me tell you this. The people who do the worst things, those who promote genocide, those who promote oppression, well, let's just stick with genocide. That's the worst, right? They almost always think they're doing the right thing. They think of themselves as ridding the world of evil. I'm sure that's what the Taliban think. They're restoring the what God intended, right? It's not, if we look at this in terms of good guys and bad guys, of humans and monsters, we're never going to be able to address it properly. So they're not monsters. They're not subhumans. They're human beings who do very, very bad things. So let me add to that. Look, I'm Jewish. I don't think Hitler was a monster. I don't think Himmler was a monster. They were people. They were human beings. And we do ourselves a disservice if we think of them as anything other than human beings.
Thank you, sir. Now I would like to invite Dr. Jenna, if you have any question. Dr. Jenna.
Shubham, please read out the questions for sir. From Mahesar Satpathy and Dr. Mahesar Satpathy and Dr. Neha Sharma as well. 2 questions in chat box.
For the
Actually, it might be easier if I look in the chat.
Yes, please,
okay.
sir, please.
Okay. So that was the first one. The second one, this is one to everyone. It says from Neha Sharma. I don't know if that's one that I need to address. Let's see. Sir, I have studied structural cultural violence of Galton. Foucault's analysis of the ability of discourse is similar kind of analysis, but yours is very different kind of analysis, reflecting original ideas. How dangerous knowledge can be inculcated into the human intellect and show its ugly face. Thank you so much. This session was really enlightening. Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. You know, let me say this. I don't believe I have the truth. I'm just trying as best I can to figure out something which I think is very important. And I'm sure my views are full of errors. And I really hope that others will come forward and correct me and find more and more accurate ways of describing dehumanization and accounting for it. And then there was a very kind remark, no questions, brilliant talk, thanks. Well, I don't know if it was brilliant, but I'm glad you found it of interest and useful. I think that's all in the chat right now.
Thank you so much for your very insightful and very wonderful deliberation. I listening you last 62.5 minutes exactly what you said about dehumanization and the sensitization of humanism and the world of ethics related to all these philosophical and psychological arguments related to in terms of history and how historical justification related to human and all these things. I would like to know something insights from you. The written documents we has been read all these times near about only 500 years. What this Gutenberg's press is concerned. How we relate these narrations from human ethics, human values, and in terms of human informations more than 2600 years ago. When we talked about India is a civilization more than 7,000 years ago. We don't know what happened with the human values and human ethics because we have very sensitized mythological understanding and we have very ancestors' relations with our own life patterns and understanding of the way of we practice our traditions and ethical values itself. In terms of this Western world, when we start thinking of realization and this vibrant idea of knowledge and this information, those are always in troubling to us to understand the human values in per se. And then in terms of free life, always we considered Europe. Europe is a continent in our planet, the free value, free thinking, and the everything free. When somebody becoming 18, the growing age of pattern, he start living separate. The what kind of humanitarian perspective we have to deal with to just adjust this perspective ideas of narration. You rightly talked about Aristotle. You mentioned about Aristotle's few things. I am a student of political science. When I was, the illusion is very problematic. The world of illusion and the academy of itself. Now, what kind of understanding do we have to relate all these targets? Please, sir, briefly analyze something.
Yeah, my sound was a little bit funny. I don't think I heard everything that you said there, particularly at the end. Could you repeat that for me, please? So I didn't hear what you said right when you actually asked me the question at the end. If you could repeat that.
Sir,
yes.
Sir, what is the illusion world of Aristotle's and the academy of Plato? What these people taught us in terms of the human values and the ethics as per concern whole world of.
Yeah, all right. So there's a little bit of problem with the connection. The sound is going funny. So look, let me say some things which I think you were asking about. So, you know, famously, if dehumanization, here's something that some people get really wrong. Dehumanization is not at all a recent phenomenon. It's taken particular forms over the last several centuries, but there are traces of it going back, you know, to the ancient world, in ancient China, Mesopotamia, certainly. And, you know, if you go back to those very ancient civilizations, in Egypt as well, the Greeks were rather newcomers. Aristotle famously described the world as divided between Greeks and barbarians. Barbarians were non-Greeks. And he described barbarians as what he called natural slaves. And by that he meant was that they didn't have the fully human capacity of reason. Aristotle associated rationality with humanness, and therefore not only could be enslaved, but would benefit from being enslaved by Greeks. And this was, in fact, a very destructive idea that persisted throughout the epoch of colonization. So Europeans justified enslaving others, often by invoking Aristotle's argument that these are natural slaves. We're doing them a favor by enslaving them. You know, we're civilizing them. We're acquainting them with our superior European ways, and so on and so forth. Religion, of course, has always, not always, has very often played a role in these processes. And in fact, religious ideologies often produce dehumanization, produce something that's very similar to dehumanization, put it that way. You see, What dehumanization does is creates a kind of distance between us and them. We are the humans, they are the inferior subhumans. But religious ideologies can have the same effect in a different way. A group of people elevates themselves above others. They are merely human. We are divine. We are doing the work of God. We are executing our sacred traditions and so on and so forth. I said that's often been the case, not always the case. Religious institutions have also taken a stand against dehumanization. So, it can go both ways. Here's something that I find really powerful. And forgive me, because the sound was problematic, I don't know to what extent I'm addressing your concerns or not.
No issue.
So one of the things that I found very, very helpful in understanding so dehumanization is often associated with authoritarian political regimes, right? We see with the Nazis, we see this again and again and again and again, that the authoritarian leader employs dehumanizing propaganda to mobilize followers, and has just a tremendous power to define the reality of his, and it usually is his, followers. I found Freud's little 1927 book on religion very, very helpful in this respect. So Freud, in this book, The Future of an Illusion, what he's trying to do is understand the psychology of religion. And he means basically Christianity. That's his main concern, and more generally, the Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Islam. And what he says is, look, we human beings are able to, we are animals that can reflect on our situation. And in doing so, we are forced to recognize our helplessness in the face of the forces of nature, and our helplessness in the face of injustice, the injustices that human beings perpetrate on one another. And this sense of helplessness, which we may try to distract ourselves from or bury, sets up in us a yearning for protection, for someone all-powerful to make it all right, to save us from our appalling condition of helplessness. And, Freud thinks, well, religion provides that function. So, we have an afterlife where the forces of nature don't kill us. And we have an afterlife in which evil is punished and good is rewarded, which doesn't happen in the actual world, right? So what I think happens in authoritarian politics is that the leader basically assumes the role of the God of salvation. If you look at the political propaganda, the way authoritarian leaders use it, they don't at first make their audience feel good. They make them feel bad. They make them feel vulnerable. They make them feel that they've betrayed the destiny of their race or their nation, that they are being exploited, so on and so forth. And then they make them frightened. There's some enemy, usually some internal enemy. For the Nazis, it was the Jews. In Myanmar, it's the Rohingya. There's some internal enemy that's to blame. And then the leader presents themselves as offering salvation from these terrors. The leader presents himself then as the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good being who can uniquely rescue these others from this terrible condition of vulnerability. And I think that explains a lot about the relationship between followers and the leaders, and explains a lot about the power of dehumanizing propaganda in that kind of context. I mean, why do people take this on? Well, they're frightened into taking it on. Okay, so in the chat here, oh, there's a bunch of stuff. Let me start. Naya Sharma, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. The doubleness of human can be seen in everyday life, violence in family, society, school, etc. What is your view on Alf Lütke's work on the history of everyday life? Also, can you tell about Heidegger, like philosophers' support for Nazism? I don't know anything of Lütke's work, so I can't comment at all. Philosophers' support for Heidegger. Look, philosophy has a very long history of participation in oppressive and genocidal regimes. If you look at the history of Western philosophy, I might talked about Aristotle, an endorser of slavery, whose views were very important to the later European colonists, who used him to justify their abuses. You can think of many of the great European philosophers who were either silent on the horrors of colonialism or endorsed them and profited from them. Now, none of these were actually explicitly endorsed an explicitly genocidal regime like Nazism, like Heidegger did. But there's a nasty history there. Look, philosophers are by no means exempt from embracing terrible things. Indeed, philosophers, I think, have a remarkable capacity often to detach themselves from reality, and thus to at least tolerate and certainly not object to these sorts of horrors that have been implemented throughout human history. So don't idealize philosophy. In the Nazi regime, not just philosophers, but many people in the humanities and the social sciences were big supporters, big time supporters of the regime. And just by the way, a lot of the senior people in the regime, were highly educated people. They weren't stupid. They weren't uneducated. And a lot of them were philosophically educated because that was part of a classical German education. So, and by the way, I'm not a Heidegger fan.
Okay, sir. Sir, thank you so much for your answer. And I would like to share some of your ideas.
Okay.
So you take a question or otherwise take a submission, what you take it your own. Sir, you rightly talked about the contradictory part of inhumanization and dehumanization or humanization per se, the masters, and you rightly know who is the knowledge master in the planet. When these people are always targeting our minds in terms of globalization and nationalization.
Yeah.
In terms of your own ideas of related the philosophical enthusiasm related to these human minds per se, or these big players as concerned in terms of knowledge economy or in terms of knowledge is information. Over on observations, ideas, past research career you have in the rightly field of dehumanization. Please.
I'm sorry again. The sound kept cutting out, so I couldn't hear all of what you said. It's the
okay, sir. We'll write, sir. We'll write.
Okay, great. That would be great. Meanwhile, let's see. Please kindly address my question where from above and from below the condition arises where we see the philosophers, teachers, and doctors, scientists supported Nazisms like Heidegger, and how can see feudalism in Western Germany is underlying problem of the condition. The condition is not one way, but centering around from many sides, in that how unavoidable is it to be inhuman? I don't think it's unavoidable, but I think we have to really understand what we're dealing with and find ways of resisting the pressures that are brought to bear on us every day. And there are two sides to this. Well, maybe more than two sides. Self-knowledge is extraordinarily important. It's very, very important to understand that all of us are capable of dehumanization. It's part of the human condition that we are capable of it. That doesn't mean we're all going to dehumanize others, but we all have that possibility. If you close your eyes to that, then you're opening yourself to being influenced in ways you don't want to be influenced in. So we have to be vigilant. We have to understand this about ourselves. And that's part of the reason why I say we shouldn't think of people who commit terrible atrocities as monsters, because that's a way of denying that this capacity is part of the human condition. Another very important thing related to this is understanding history properly. Most groups of people, maybe all groups of people, have blood on their hands somewhere in their history. Nations are born in violence, they're maintained in oppression. But often these facts about the history of one's own group are suppressed. Certainly that's the case in the United States, that the real history is often not taught, the darker sides of history. But it's very important that it is taught, because that helps us understand what we are capable of. And it introduces a note of humility. Because if we realize, of course, that we've committed such acts in the past, then it opens us to thinking maybe we're doing it now. And if we're not doing it now, maybe we will do it in the future. And that provides some incentive for working against the dehumanizing impulse. But of course, another thing that's extraordinarily important is political action. We need to address not just ourselves and our attitudes, but those features of the world, the features of the political world that induce us to think of others as less than human. I personally think the idea of race is extraordinarily toxic and is often the gateway into dehumanization. I wish we could get rid of the very idea of race. I don't see that happening, but I think we should all resist it. The caste in India is a rough equivalent. That it needs to be resisted. It's a gateway to dehumanization. So, once authoritarian leaders get into power, these processes are much, much, much more difficult to stop. So we all need to work to put safeguards into place to prevent that from happening. Now, everything that I've listed, and there's much more that could be said, none of it is bulletproof, right? There is no vaccine. Unlike COVID, there's no vaccine against dehumanization. There are no surefire protections against episodes of dehumanization occurring. And frankly, I think the more vulnerable the position of people is, the more likely it is to occur. One of the things that I really, really worry about are the consequences of climate change. where there will be massive movements of refugees. And the affluent nations will shut their doors, try to protect their way of life. It's, to my mind, it's an obvious perfect storm for the emergence of authoritarian, indeed fascist, political leaders and the most dangerous, the most toxic, the most destructive forms of dehumanization. So here's the question. Now we've got to this. So what is your ideas of nationalism, globalization, the outcome, tools of knowledge, players in the 21st century's global for humanization or dehumanization? What is your observations in eras of corporatization, in the ethics of profit, and only profit is important to them? Well, yes, I mean, historically, capitalism has played a huge role in dehumanization. Certainly, the history of colonization and the history of slavery in the West is, and both of which involved profound and horrific forms of dehumanization, were products of capitalism. But dehumanization is not only the products of capitalism. It's very important, right? Dehumanization occurs in pre-capitalist society. Globalization, in certain respects, can work against dehumanization. It can also work in favor of dehumanization. Here's the thing: to the extent that these processes are in the service of exploitation, then they're likely to be in the service of dehumanization. They're likely to encourage dehumanization. But there are, of course, other forces historically that have been in the service of exploitation, right? So I think what's important is to get to the core issue. How do you, under what circumstances are people inclined to commit, and I'm talking about people in general, to commit these sorts of abuses against other people? That's the core of it. And of course, there are many different circumstances in which that can occur, and many types of forces that can encourage it.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to request Professor Shubham Das to go for a vote of thanks as well.
On behalf of the Center for Adivasi Research and Development, I take this opportunity to propose vote of thanks to those who have directly and indirectly contributed to this World Human Science and Management Conference. At the outset, I thank our esteemed guest speaker, Professor David Livingstone Smith. We are really enlightened with your deliverance on the idea of dehumanization and theorizing it in a very lucid manner. We are also thankful to our coordinating institution, IIM Sambalpur, Central University of Odisha, Koraput, and Ravenshaw University, Cuttack, for their support and guidance to organize this event. I would also like to thank Professor Sanjay Naik, the Vice Chancellor of Ravenshaw University, Professor S.K. Palita, esteemed Vice Chancellor of Central University of Odisha, and Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Director IIM Sambalpur, and Dr. Bikram Jana, Director of Center for Adivasi Research and Development. I would also like to thank our conveners of this conference, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda and Charudatta Panigrahi, for their motivation and guidance. A special thank to the organizing committee members, Professor Srinivasudu NS, Dr. Sudarshan Mishra, Professor Loknath Mishra, Professor Bisit Das, Savan Bag, Nupur Patnaik, Amul Acharya, Rudranarayan Das, Chinmay Sao, Dr. Kamal Prasad Mohanty, Samuel Lima, and Neha Sharma for their unflinching support and coordination. Our heartfelt thanks to all the academicians, research scholars, and students for their active participation. With these warm words and a kind message, we move to the end of the today's session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. And looking forward for future engagements and need time to time your advice to just establishing this center. And we are working sincerely for these marginalized communities. And your thankfulness and your approach of this kind of support will encourage us in future. With this note, we end here, and namaskar from India.
Thank you so much. It's an honor, it really is. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.